Welcome to another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. My name is Steve Fielding. These stories are taken from my 3-volume series of books, The Hangman's Record, covering every execution in Great Britain and Ireland between 1868 and 1964. Copies of these, and many of my other titles, can be obtained through my website, stevefielding.com. If you enjoy the video, please subscribe and press like to help us reach a wider audience. If you can spare £1 or $2 to help the channel to continue to grow, donations can be made by clicking the thanks button below the video or in the link paypal.me/thehangmansrecord. As always, use the comments below for thoughts on the case, whether justice was seen to be done, and suggestions for future episodes in the series are always welcomed. Today's tale from the Hangman's Record looks at 2 cases that contain many similarities. The first takes us back to the summer of 1940. King George VI is on the throne and Winston Churchill has recently taken over from Neville Chamberlain as the Prime Minister of a coalition government. Franklin D. Roosevelt is the President of the United States, which is still almost 2 years away from Pearl Harbor. The UK has been at war for just a few months, but already food rationing is in place, and on January the 1st, 2 million young men between the ages of 19 and 27 are called up for military service. In May, with the threat of invasion imminent, recruitment begins for the local defence volunteers, which by the time the crime in this first story is committed has been renamed the Home Guard. The news is dominated with the war, with the evacuation of Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain and the Blitz being the 3 biggest events of the year, while television is shut down for the duration of hostilities, fearing that the signals would help German bombers. Away from the war, in literature, Agatha Christie publishes Sad Cypress and One Two Buckle My Shoe, whilst in music, amongst the most popular artists are Bing Crosby, Glenn Miller and George Formby. And in the cinema, Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, Disney's Fantasia, The Philadelphia Story and Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca are amongst the biggest grossing movies. And that summer, as enemy planes fly overhead, death comes to tea in a quiet corner of southern England. Tuesday, 9th of July 1940, the first summer of the Second World War, and in the skies above the southeast of England is a relentless drone. The Luftwaffe is striking with a vengeance as over 70 planes, a mix of Messerschmitts and Heinkels, sweep in over the Straits of Dover. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. But as the shadow of death darkens the sky, its presence is also making its way down one of the quiet country lanes below. As Spitfires and Hurricanes rise to meet the invaders, a telephone rings unanswered in the drawing room in a house on the outskirts of the Kent village of Matfield, some 6 miles south of Tunbridge. Screened from the road by a large orchard, Crittenden, a pretty country cottage, was occupied by Dorothy Fisher, her 19-year-old daughter Freda and 45-year-old housekeeper Charlotte Saunders. The telephone call had been made by Dorothy's aged mother, Harriet Gibbs, who lived close by. She had been expecting her to come for tea and became concerned when she failed to appear. With repeated phone calls going unanswered, Mrs. Gibbs sent her gardener to find out why. At 6:45, John Lurie arrived at Crittenden and found at once an explanation for the silence. Making his way up the drive, he immediately saw a body lying on the ground, and turning on his heels wasted no time in contacting wartime Special Constable Harry Cookman, who lived in the village. 10 minutes later, Cookman arrived in Crittenden and saw the body of a woman, and in the grounds found the bodies of 2 other women. All had clearly been shot dead. He immediately reported back his findings and was soon joined at the scene by Superintendent Frank Smead and detectives from Kent Constabulary. Smead arrived at 9:15 and saw the body of a woman lying outside the house. He examined the overgrown orchard at the back of the cottage, where he saw the body of a young woman in a gateway, and at the far end, another body of a woman. All the doors into the house were open, and a search found it empty but for a whimpering dachshund locked in one of the rooms. The bodies of the three women were scattered around the orchard, shot down in their tracks, seemingly as they vainly tried to flee from some unknown terror. Freda Fisher was lying stretched across the orchard path, shot in the back, straight between the shoulder blades. It appeared that her mother, having witnessed this shooting, had fled with the killer following close behind. There were signs she had run through the knee-high grass and weeds and leapt across a ditch before stumbling against a small wicker gate at the edge of the wood. Here she too had been shot in the back. From the position of the third body, it was easy to work out that Miss Saunders, the housekeeper, must have come face to face with the killer at the front door of the cottage. Her wounds were between the temple and right ear. At midnight, Medical Superintendent Dr. Ernest Grasby saw the bodies of the three victims at the Pembrey County Hospital. He told Superintendent Smead death had been instantaneous in each case and had occurred somewhere between 8 and 6 o'clock that day. Smead immediately decided to put a call through to Scotland Yard, requesting their assistance. Recently appointed Detective Chief Inspector Peter Beveridge of the Flying Squad was then assigned his first murder case. He selected as his assistant Detective Sergeant Albert Tansil, but before they ventured out of London, Beveridge learned a little more about the victims. Mrs. Fisher had recently come to the attention of Kent Police when she had requested that her Dutch boyfriend, Stephen Watergaard, be allowed to visit. With the imminent threat of invasion, parts of Kent were out of bounds to non-residents and only open to military personnel, and the request had been refused. Watergaard lived in a West London flat, where the two Scotland Yard detectives interviewed him. They noted his shock and upset was genuine, and once he was able to satisfy them of his movements, and a search of his apartment found no sign of any weapons, he was eliminated from their inquiries. They then made their way out of London and navigated through the blackout-enforced Kent countryside to the scene of the murder. The house was in a state of disorder. Cupboards and drawers had been emptied on the floor, and it seemed the three women had been killed by someone who had then rummaged through and robbed the house. Beveridge ordered a search of the nearby grounds, where they found a lady's bicycle some 50 yards from the house, but their attention was focused more upon a woman's left-handed white hogskin glove lying halfway between the two bodies in the orchard. It looked new and was obviously not the kind one would wear while gardening, and Beveridge asked his sergeant if he could find the matching one. Did this woman's glove belong to the killer? As fingerprint experts went to work in the cottage, the detective interested himself in the broken crockery. Something had caused the maid to drop the tray on the stone floor of the scullery, breaking the china into hundreds of pieces. Was it the sound of the shots, the women's screams, or a sudden confrontation with the killer? Beveridge began piecing the fragments together and found they built up into 4 complete cups and saucers. 3 bodies and 4 cups. Who was the extra person for whom tea had been prepared? Detective Sergeant Tansil told him he found no signs of the other glove during the search, but did reveal something that would change the focus of the investigation. Despite the upturned and emptied drawers, there was plenty of money and a large amount of jewellery easily discovered inside the house. Although this was his first murder investigation, Beveridge was an experienced detective and knew that this was hardly the work of a skilled housebreaker, and instead had all the hallmarks of a fake or staged break-in. Looking further into the background of the victims, Beveridge learned that Dorothy had married Walter Lawrence Fisher in the summer of 1913 and had 2 daughters, Joan, who had married and moved out, and 19-year-old Freda. Sometime before the war broke out, while living in Twickenham, Mr. and Mrs. Fisher split up and went their own ways, with each taking a new lover. Once new relationships had been formed, the separated couple remained the best of friends. Dorothy's partner, Dane Stephen Watergaard, had already been eliminated from their inquiries. Walter Fisher had fallen in love with 35-year-old widow Florence Iris Ouida Ransom. He had taken the cottage at Matfield, where Mrs. Ransom was in the habit of staying at weekends. Then, in early 1940, he moved in with Mrs. Ransom at a farm he had purchased at Piddington, near Bicester in Oxfordshire. Mrs. Fisher and her daughter Freda now became the tenants of the Kent cottage. the arrangement evidently being amenable, as Fisher often travelled down to the cottage to see his daughter and assure himself all was well. He also provided money so the housekeeper could be engaged. Later that night, the detectives motored the 70 miles to Piddington and spoke to Walter Fisher. He was able to show he had an alibi for the time of the shooting. Beveridge asked about Mrs. Ransom and was informed she was in bed recovering from injuries and bruises received in a fall which he said had been caused when she had chased her cat. Once she was aware that the police were at the house, she dressed and came downstairs, and for the first time Beveridge and Tansel were introduced to Florence Iris Ouida Ransom. They found her a slightly built, attractive, auburn-haired widow who acted as a secretary and manager at the farm. Asked to account for her movements at the time of the crime, she said she had not left the farm, adding, "Ask the woman servant, she will tell you the same." She admitted that she knew the Fisher family very well and had frequently visited them, but not on that particular day. As he was about to leave, Beveridge pulled a glove from his pocket and asked if she would try it on. "Certainly I'll try," Mrs. Ransom said, "although I think it's too small for me." Beveridge felt that the glove fitted perfectly. As the Chief Inspector was questioning Mrs. Ransom, Sergeant Tansel went outside to speak to the staff, and a few shrewd questions soon revealed that the servant was Mrs. Ransom's own mother. And crucially, she admitted she was not actually certain her daughter was in the house at the time of the killings. Convinced that this mystery was tied up in a tangle of relationships, the Scotland Yard detective drove back to Tunbridge, where they joined Home Office pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury in time for the post-mortem. Spilsbury had hardly begun his task when he paused and declared that the wounds were not made with a revolver. They were made by a shotgun. Beveridge recalls seeing a shotgun in the kitchen at Piddington a few hours earlier. The sound of a shotgun in that part of the countryside, swarmed with troops continually training, digging trenches and manning the first lines of defence, would certainly go unnoticed, so the exact time of the attack remained unknown beyond the vague estimates Spilsbury and Dr. Grasby could give. Piecing together events at the cottage, Beveridge felt that evidence of the teacup suggested the assailant was clearly on friendly terms. Then, while the maid was preparing tea for four, the killer had somehow managed to lure Dorothy and Freda outside and shot them both in the back. They had then reloaded the shotgun and shot Charlotte Saunders in the head, and to make it appear the killer was a burglar, had left the house in a state of disorder, but crucially, nothing of any value was missing. And, found at the scene, was a woman's glove and bicycle. Pondering a motive for the crime, Beveridge believed that the visits to Matfield by Walter Fisher may have aroused the jealousy of Mrs. Ransom. He re-interviewed the staff at Piddington and learned that 3 weeks earlier she had asked the farmhand, Fred Guilford, if the shotgun was dangerous and if it would kill anyone. Not at a distance, she was told. You would have to get very close to someone. A few days later, she asked him how the gun worked and would he teach her to shoot rabbits with it. The farmhand, who, unbeknown to Walter Fisher, was actually her own brother, showed her how it fired and gave her a dozen cartridges. Then, on Wednesday the 10th of July, the day after the triple murder, when her brother went in search of his gun, Florence handed it back, telling him to clean it as it had been in the wet. He asked if he'd used all the cartridges and was told she hadn't, as she was scared and had thrown them away. Beveridge was told that a week before the crime, Mrs. Ransom asked to be shown how to ride a bicycle, and for 20 minutes she had circled round the farmyard but was not very confident or that proficient. Detectives combing the neighbourhood had discovered the lady's bicycle abandoned in a ditch. It was identified as belonging to Mrs. Fisher, and the only fingerprints on the handlebars were definitely hers. No further lead there. But why was it discarded in such a way? Had it been used to assist the killer's flight? Although the clues were mounting, and she was her number one suspect, there was nothing yet to justify the arrest of Mrs. Ransom. The only real evidence Beveridge had was the woman's glove, which he believed fitted perfectly. It was going to be necessary to prove her presence at Crittenden on the afternoon of the crime. Investigations then found a number of witnesses who had seen a woman acting suspiciously near the cottage on the day of the murder. One saw a woman close by carrying a long, narrow-shaped brown paper parcel, and an errand boy saw a red-haired woman peering through the hedge at the cottage. A railway porter had seen a woman matching her description alight from the 12:08 train at Tunbridge, and at 3:45, a lorry driver gave a red-haired woman a lift back to Tunbridge railway station. Reviewing this information, Beveridge reconstructed how he felt the crime had been committed. Wrapping the gun in brown paper, Mrs. Ransom had caught the train to Tunbridge via London. Her original plan was probably to get into the orchard and lie in wait for one or the other woman to appear. Becoming impatient, she had then called at the house. While the maid prepared tea, Mrs. Ransom found some pretext to get the women outside. Freda was shot first as she walked along the path ahead of Mrs. Ransom. Then Mrs. Fisher must have turned and run to the other side of the orchard, where she too was shot in the back. Then, reloading the shotgun, Ransom fired at the woman's neck as she lay on the ground. Returning to where Freda lay, she had then reloaded and fired 2 more shots into the girl's left side. Realising then it was necessary to be rid of the only witness, she returned to the house, entered the scullery as the maid was about to bring out the cups of tea. Sensing danger, Charlotte Saunders had dropped the tray and tried to flee, only to be intercepted by Mrs. Ransom. Another shot and the killing spree had ended. Mrs. Ransom must have then staged the robbery and planned to use a bicycle to return to Tunbridge, but had fallen off and abandoned it and instead hitched a lift with the lorry driver. She had then caught the 4:25 train to London and arrived back at the farm later that night. Detectives hurried back to the Oxford farm only to find Mrs. Ransom had gone to see a doctor in London. A call was put through to Scotland Yard asking for a detective to locate the widow when her train arrived at Paddington Station and to watch her every move. Beveridge then picked up the trail of Mrs. Ransom as she crossed the city to keep an appointment in Holborn, where a newspaper photographer captured the moment as she was arrested. Taken to Scotland Yard, she made a statement denying any involvement in the crime before being told she would be detained at Cannon Road Police Station, pending further inquiries. On Saturday 13th of July, Florence Ransom was told she would be taken back to Tunbridge, where she would be put up for identification on suspicion of causing the death of the 3 women. She made no reply. On Monday, Mrs. Ransom was examined and found to have bruises on the right thigh and below the knee. There were also 4 bruises on the left thigh and a smaller one in the region of the left knee. All were approximately a week old and consistent with someone falling off a bicycle. Later that day, she was placed in an identification parade at Tunbridge Police Station and picked out by the witnesses who had seen her near the house. At 3 o'clock that same day, Beveridge cautioned Mrs. Ransom and said he was charging her with the murder of the 3 women. "I didn't do it, how could I?" she replied, when formally charged with the murder of Dorothy Fisher. To the charge of respecting Freda Fisher, she cried, "No, no," and made no reply to the charge in respect of Charlotte Saunders. Following a series of remand hearings, and after Florence Ransom had spent some time in the Holloway Prison Hospital following a nervous breakdown, she was committed to stand trial at the Old Bailey. The first hearing before Mr. Justice Hallett on Monday the 23rd of September was adjourned so that Stuart Horner, her defence barrister, could have Mrs. Ransom examined by a neurologist. The trial then began before Mr. Justice Tucker at the Old Bailey on the 7th of November. She was charged with 3 counts of murder, and it was to be the first murder trial in which the jurors were allowed to go home for the weekend rather than be obliged to stay in a hotel, a provision introduced because of the danger from air raids in the capital. Mr. St. John Hutchinson, leading for the prosecution, called several witnesses, including Walter Fisher and Florence Ransom's mother and brother, all of whom gave damning evidence as to her behaviour on the evening of the murders. Hutchinson alleged that the visits to Matfield by Walter Fisher had made Ransom so jealous it led her to commit a triple murder. The evidence against her was circumstantial, with the most valuable clue left at the scene being a woman's white hogskin glove, the property of Mrs. Ransom. It was shown to fit Florence's hand and was assumed that she had dropped the glove while removing the first of the discharged shotgun cartridges. The only defence witness called was Florence Ransom herself, who denied any involvement but claimed her memory of the day in question was a complete blank. Her appearance in the dock confirmed this view. She was a very attractive woman with red hair, but had a strange, brooding look in her eyes. Nevertheless, she endured several hours of fierce cross-examination without turning her hair. Evidence of her mental instability was put forward, and the court heard that she had previously been a voluntary inpatient in a number of hospitals and mental homes. However, this was insufficient to sway the jury, and on Tuesday the 12th of November, they took just 47 minutes to find her guilty. With a black cap draped on his wig, Mr. Justice Tucker sentenced her to death. An appeal was submitted on the grounds that insufficient regard had been made to the possibility that Florence Ransom was clinically insane. But on Monday the 9th of December, it was dismissed. She began screaming hysterically as the verdict was returned and had to be ushered out of the court in great distress. She was returned to the condemned cell at Holloway jail, and a date of Tuesday the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, was fixed for her execution. Thomas Pierrepoint was already engaged to carry out an execution on that date, but it was likely the engagement was offered to the only other experienced number 1 hangman on the list, Stanley Cross. Londoner Cross had already carried out one execution at Pentonville that summer, and on the day after her appeal was refused, had hanged the first 2 enemy spies to be convicted during the war. However, the Home Secretary asked for a medical inquiry, and on Saturday the 21st of December, Florence Ransom was judged to be insane, the death penalty commuted, and she was committed to be detained during His Majesty's pleasure at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. Florence Ransom served 26 years before being released after being described as a model prisoner. In the spring of 1948, inmates at the asylum staged a play. Under the heading Broadmoor Puts on a Play, the London Evening Standard of March the 4th gave a critique of a theatrical production entitled The Earl and the Girl. The last paragraph read, "One of the most outstanding performances of the night was given by Daphne Brent, who played the part of a fairground dog trainer's girlfriend and did so with an aplomb that would have startled many experienced actors and actresses." The Sunday Mirror recorded that a Broadmoor warder had told its reporter, "Some of us can't believe she's not normal." Daphne Brent was the pseudonym of Florence Iris Ouida Ransom. In January 1967, at the age of 63, Florence Ransom was discharged from Broadmoor and settled in Cardiff, where she died 2 years later. Her probate record, in a maiden name Florence Iris Ouida Guilford, said she died on the 16th of December 1969 and left an estate valued at £139, just over $3,200 in 2025. For our second case, we travel forward 15 years, to the spring of 1955, and a Britain still recovering from war. It is a nation in transition. Wartime leader Winston Churchill, back as Prime Minister after being unseated at the end of the war, has been in number 10 since October 1951, but will resign in April due to ill health and be replaced by Anthony Eden. Across the Atlantic, Dwight D. Eisenhower continues as the President of the United States. The music charts are dominated by a mixture of sentimental ballads and imported American records. The biggest selling single in the early months is Tennessee Ernie Ford's Give Me Your Word, and other big hits that spring include Mambo Italiano and Cherry Pink and Apple Blossom White. By the summer, the Teddy Boy subculture has firmly taken root in most cities, creating the first real youth fashion movement. By the end of November, Rock Around the Clock from the film Blackboard Jungle would be the number 1 record. When the movie is shown in cinemas, it would see teenagers dancing and fighting in the aisles. At the cinema, war films are still amongst the most popular, with The Dam Busters, Cockleshell Heroes and Above Us the Waves all being released. In world events, Elvis Presley makes his TV debut on Louisiana Hayride, the first edition of the Guinness Book of Records is published, and the first McDonald's restaurant is opened in Illinois. In May, West Germany becomes recognised as a sovereign country and joins NATO. The year will see the deaths of Nobel Prize winners scientist Alexander Fleming, physicist Albert Einstein, and German novelist Thomas Mann. Portuguese singer Carmen Miranda dies at the age of 46, and Italian racing driver Alberto Ascari and American actor James Dean are both killed in motor accidents. And in the North London suburb of Hampstead, a sensational murder takes place that will be recalled in numerous books, plays, TV dramas and films over the next 70 years. It was in 1953 that Ruth Ellis became the manager of the Little Club, a nightclub on 27 Brompton Road in London's West End. Born in Rhyl, North Wales on the 9th of October 1926 to musician father Arthur Nielsen and mother Bertha Goodall, a Belgian refugee from the First World War, the family relocated south to Basingstoke where, in 1944, at the age of 17, she became pregnant by Claire Andrea McCallum, a married Canadian soldier. In September she gave birth to a son, named after the father, but known as Andy. McCallum returned to Canada at the end of the war, but within a year stopped sending over money for the son's upkeep. With the boy being cared for by Ruth's mother and older sister Muriel, she found work as a photographer's assistant and worked as a model at the Camera Club London, where for money she would pose for members' pictures in risky lingerie and even in the nude. She then met Vice King Maurice Conley, who owned the Court Club, a seedy venue in Duke Street near Grosvenor Square, where she began working as a hostess. Working in clubland soon began to take its toll. She started drinking heavily, mostly with clients out for a good time. Then she thought she had found salvation. One of the clients was 41-year-old George Ellis, a divorced dentist with 2 sons. By early 1950, she was making money as an escort, but in November married George Ellis at a registry office at Tunbridge in Kent, in the hope he would provide security for her and her son. She was soon to discover that Ellis, a regular customer at the Court Club, was a possessive alcoholic who had become convinced his new wife was having an affair. Their jealous quarrels would often become violent, causing Ruth to pack her bags and leave him on a number of occasions. They moved to Southampton, where they had a daughter, Georgina, but with Ellis originally refusing to acknowledge paternity, they separated and later divorced. She then went back to London, taking her children with her. The Little Club, close to Knightsbridge Tube Station, was the haunt of businessmen and a number of famous racing drivers and their hangers-on, the most notable being Mike Hawthorne, at the time driving for Ferrari in Formula One. Ruth was an attractive peroxide blonde and proved to be a very popular hostess and escort. She dressed in smart clothes and used her charm and bubbly personality to persuade customers in the club to buy their expensive drinks. She earned good money, much of which went to her mother and sister for the upkeep of the children. It was there in 1953 that 2 men came into Ruth's life. Through Mike Hawthorne she met David Blakely, a 24-year-old racing driver and playboy, 3 years her junior. Born in Sheffield to a Scottish doctor and an Irish mother, former public schoolboy David Moffat Drummond Blakely had been educated at Shrewsbury School and the Saunders Royal Military Academy and had a family home in Buckinghamshire, as well as sharing a London flat with his brother John. Following the death of his father, he was left a £7,000 inheritance, equivalent to £250,000 in 2025, all of which went into developing and racing cars. Within weeks of meeting Ruth Ellis, and despite him being engaged to another woman, the pair were sleeping together in her flat above the Knightsbridge Club. This soon developed into a tempestuous and violent love-hate relationship. Also at the club, Ruth had met Desmond Cousin, a former Royal Air Force pilot who had flown Lancaster bombers during the Second World War, before becoming an accountant. Ellis also began seeing Cousin, now a director of family wholesale and retail tobacconist, and eventually moved in with him at 20 Goodwood Court, Devonshire Street, north of Oxford Street. Cousin quickly became besotted with Ruth Ellis. However, her relationship with David Blakely continued, despite him becoming increasingly violent as they both continued to see other people. Wealthy Cousin offered Ruth Ellis security and a stable home for her children, but her heart ruled her head, and when Blakely proposed marriage, she readily agreed, moved out to Goodwood Court and shared a flat with Blakely in Kensington. Despite this, their relationship remained tempestuous, and in January 1955, following another violent quarrel, she suffered a miscarriage after he punched her in the stomach during an argument. In February 1955, police were called to Cousins' Goodwood Court apartment, where Blakely claimed Ellis had tried to stab him. It was clear to the officers that this was a domestic quarrel that had got out of hand, as Ruth Ellis was also sporting a black eye and other bruises. With a warning issued to the pair, the police left. 2 months after losing the baby, she suffered another miscarriage, again through Blakely assaulting her. To compound matters, he now began to ignore her, staying out at night without telling her and choosing instead to drink with friends, including at least one woman known to have been his lover. Ellis became obsessed, hurt, angry and frustrated, and driven by alcohol and jealousy, sought retribution. One of Blakely's motor racing friends was Anthony Finletter, who lived with his wife Carol at 29 Tanzer Road, Hampstead. Finletter, a former Aston Martin mechanic, worked on and helped develop Blakely's Emperor racing car, and Blakely repaid him by sleeping with his wife. When Finletter found out, he forgave him, but when Ruth learned of this, she became enraged. She continued to drink heavily, whilst never too far from her side, the besotted cousin would often drive her when she wanted to know what Blakely was up to. David Blakely's racing career had had mixed success over the years. Initially it had been quite promising, with him winning his early races, but as he stepped up in class, the victories became less and several races were ruined by reliability and mechanical issues. However, in the spring of 1955, he was selected to race at the prestigious 24-hour Le Mans in France and presented Ellis with a photograph signed, "To Ruth, with all my love, David." Then, on Good Friday, the 8th of April, 6 days after his final race at Brands Hatch, without informing Ellis, Blakely went to stay the weekend with the Finletters so they could discuss improvements to the car in readiness for the endurance race. While there, he told them he planned to move out of the flat and never wanted to see Ruth again. Trying to track him down, Ellis repeatedly telephoned the Finletters, who simply chose to ignore her. In a rage, she called cousin, who drove her to 29 Tanzer Road, where an almighty row took place when she pushed in the windows of Blakely's Standard Vanguard estate. The police were again called and found Ellis screaming at Blakely and his friends, but instead of dealing with the incident, they again just told them to keep the noise down and left. Desmond Cousin drove Ruth Ellis home and she seethed in a jealous rage. Blakely and Finletter spent all the Easter weekend working on improvements for the car, with friends often calling round for drinks. On Easter Sunday, the 10th of April, Blakely and friend Clive Gunnell left a little party at the Finletters, climbed into Blakely's car and drove to the nearby Magdala Tavern on South Hill Park to buy cigarettes and beer to take back to the party. What then happened was argued at the trial, as Ruth Ellis refused to involve anyone else in the police investigation. Blakely had previously promised to take her and Andy to the local fair that afternoon, and when he stood them up, she became enraged. It was said she took a taxi to Tanzer Road and arrived to find that Blakely's car wasn't there. She got out of the cab intending to wait for his return, but after a few minutes decided to go to search for him. Knowing he would often drink at the Magdala, she set off on foot to see if he was there. Her route took her up Tanzer Road and then left down Parliament Hill Road towards the tavern. As he reached the junction with South Hill Park, he could see Blakely's Standard Vanguard estate perched outside. She stood in the doorway of the newsagents next door and waited. At around 9:30, the two men emerged and made straight for the car, oblivious to Ruth Ellis standing in the shadows as Blakely rummaged for the keys in his jacket pocket. She then stepped out of the doorway and called out, "David." Blakely ignored her and continued to search for the keys. Silently taking a revolver from her handbag, she pointed it at David Blakely and fired. The first shot missed. Ellis then stalked to terrify Blakely as he moved round the car and attempted to make a getaway. She then fired a second shot that struck him in the back and caused him to slump onto the pavement. Calmly approaching his stricken body, she stood over him and fired 3 more shots. Clive Gunnell watched in horror as Ellis stared down at Blakely before discharging the 6th bullet. This one missed and ricocheted off the road striking the hand of passerby Gladys Ewell, who, with her husband Donald, was making her way from their Parliament Hill Road home to the Magdala for a drink. Stepping back from the car, Ellis, clearly in shock, turned to Gunnell. "Will you call the police, Clive?" Off-duty PC Alan Thompson was enjoying a drink with friends in the tavern and, with a policeman's alertness to his surroundings, had spotted the blonde woman peering through the rippled glass door near the bar a few minutes earlier. The shots, which he quickly differentiated from a car misfiring, had seen him put down his drink and go outside in time to hear her say, "I am guilty, I am a little confused." Thompson took the gun from her hand, placed it under arrest and shouted for someone to call the police and an ambulance. Davy Blakely was taken to the nearby New End Hospital with multiple wounds to the intestine, liver, lung, aorta and trachea. He was pronounced dead on arrival. At Hampstead Police Station, Ruth Ellis appeared to be calm and lucid, showing no sign of being under the influence of drugs, nor was she particularly drunk. She made a brief statement before being charged with murder and made her first appearance at the Magistrates' Court on the following morning. The short hearing ended with her ordered to be held on remand at Holloway Jail, where in due course she was examined by 2 psychiatrists, one for the defence and another for the Home Office. Neither found any evidence of insanity. She was then examined twice by the principal medical officer at Holloway, who also failed to find any evidence of mental illness. On Monday the 20th of June, Ruth Ellis appeared in the No. 1 Court at the Old Bailey, London, before Mr Justice Havers. Dressed in a black suit and white silk blouse, with her blonde hair freshly bleached and styled, she ignored requests by her solicitor to tone down the image, feeling her sombre appearance may gather more sympathy from the jury. The trial lasted barely 2 days, with the main points being, was she guilty of murder or manslaughter, and was she of sound mind? Medical evidence had already confirmed no sign of insanity. Leading for the prosecution, Mr Christmas Humphreys QC, said that this woman had acquired a gun, was driven to a place she believed her intended victim to be, and where she had shot him in cold blood, not once but 5 times. It was hardly a spontaneous act or done in self-defence, and it mattered not that she had been the victim of so much violence at the hands of the man she was charged with murdering. The most decisive question put to Ellis by Prosecutor Humphreys was simply, when you fired the revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do? Her answer as good as put the noose around her neck. It was obvious when I shot him I intended to kill him. Leading for her defence, Aubrey Melford Stevenson QC, was facing a hopeless task. If he could persuade Ruth Ellis to say who had given her the gun and driven her to Hampstead that night, he may be able to get the charge reduced to manslaughter. Ellis, however, was refusing to change her story or divulge anything that implicated anyone else and seemed resigned to her fate. With all the evidence presented and the judges summing up concluded, the jury was asked to consider their verdict. They took just 20 minutes to find Ruth Ellis guilty as charged. She smiled to her family in the gallery as Mr Justice Havers, with the black cap draped on his wig, for just the 4th occasion in his time on the bench, passed sentence of death. Ellis was returned to Holloway Jail, this time to the condemned cell. It had last been occupied by Cypriot grandmother Stylu Christophe a little over 6 months earlier, and who had been hanged for a murder committed just a few hundred yards from the Magdala Tavern. We covered this case in episode 34 of Tales from the Hangman's Record. Ruth Ellis told her mother that she did not want to appeal against the sentence, nor sanction a petition for a reprieve, and would not support the campaign. However, at the request of relatives, Solicitor John Bickford, asked to handle the case by Desmond Cousin, wrote a detailed letter to Home Secretary William Lord George, setting out the grounds for a reprieve. Learning of this, Ellis dismissed Bickford and appointed Victor Mishcon, former chairman of London County Council, whose law firm had represented her in the divorce proceedings with George Ellis. On Tuesday the 12th of July, the day before her execution, Mishcon saw Ellis to help her make a will. When he pressed her for the full story, she asked him to promise not to use what she had said to try to secure a reprieve. Desperate to save her from the gallows by any means possible, Mishcon refused. Ellis had told him that Cousin had given her the gun and taught her how to use it on the weekend prior to the murder, She also revealed that on the night of the murder, it was he who had driven her to Hampstead. Following a 90-minute interview, Miss Conn left the jail and headed straight to the Home Office to plead for a reprieve. With the clock ticking away the last hours of Ruth Ellis's life, Permanent Secretary Sir Frank Newsom was immediately summoned back to London to deal with this new evidence. Assistant Commissioner Ronald Howe, head of the CID, was asked to look into the statement, but Home Secretary Lord George announced a short time later it made no difference to his decision. It had in fact merely shown that the murder was premeditated. Despite numerous signatures on many petitions asking for a reprieve, there were others less merciful. Gladys Ewell, struck on the hand by the bullet that had ricocheted off the pavement, had suffered a family bereavement 2 days before the murder. She had subsequently lost the use of her right thumb and, having witnessed the callous murder close up, believed that Ruth Ellis should hang for the crime. Gwilym Lord George agreed. As long as I am Home Secretary, I am determined to ensure that people could use the streets without fear of a bullet. We cannot have people shooting off firearms in the street. Ruth Ellis remained calm throughout her time in the condemned cell, and as the hangmen arrived and made their way through the crowd gathering outside the prison gates, she was visited by relatives for the last time. She also penned her final letter to Blakely's mother, writing, "I have always loved your son, and I shall die loving him." At a few minutes before 9 o'clock on Wednesday the 13th of July, with their preparations completed, Hangman Albert Pierrepoint and Assistant Royston Rickard left her quarters and headed along the corridor outside her cell to wait for the signal to begin. At that same moment, a telephone call was received in the Governor's office informing them that a last-minute reprieve had been granted to postpone the execution and await a telegram which was en route. The caller claimed to be the private secretary to Lord George and then hung up. This was an unprecedented series of events, and Prison Governor Charity Taylor immediately called the Home Office to clarify. It then took almost 6 minutes for them to confirm the call was a hoax and the execution must proceed. Pierrepoint later claimed Ruth Ellis walked to the gallows bravely and showed no fear at her imminent demise. Later that day, as her body was laid to rest in the grounds of the prison, it was announced that a wax model of Ruth Ellis would be on display in Madame Tussauds' Chamber of Horrors. The execution of Ruth Ellis caused widespread controversy and would go a long way to reforming the death penalty just a few months later. Although she was the last woman to go to the gallows, she wasn't the last to be sentenced to death. Indeed, at the time Pierrepoint was engaged to carry out her execution, he already had another date in his diary to hang a woman at Manchester and would be asked to hang another a few months later. Had Ruth Ellis committed the murder after the 1957 Homicide Act, even though murder with firearms was still a capital offence, the mistreatment and miscarriages she had suffered, physically and mentally, may well have seen a defence of diminished responsibility, which was not an option in England in 1955, reduce the charge to manslaughter. The gun used to shoot David Blakely was produced in court and became the property of Scotland Yard's Black Museum, where it remains to this day. In the early 1970s, following some demolition and rebuilding work at Holloway, the remains of the executed women were exhumed for reburial at Breakwood Cemetery in Woking, with the exception of Ruth Ellis, whose remains were reburied in a churchyard of St Mary's in Amersham, Buckinghamshire, just 3 miles from where David Blakely was buried. Her headstone is inscribed Ruth Hornby, 1926-1955. The 1955 Le Mans race, in which Blakely would have raced had he not been brutally murdered, was to see the most catastrophic crash in the history of motorsport. On the 11th of June, an accident occurred as Mike Hawthorne, driving a Jaguar, slowed to enter the pit. The driver behind him swerved out into the path of Frenchman Pierre Levage in a Mercedes. The collision sent his car hurtling off the track and into the crowded grandstand at over 125 miles an hour, where it disintegrated and burst into flames, killing over 80 spectators and the French driver. Despite the horrific disaster and mounting casualties, the race continued, and with both Mercedes and Ferrari withdrawing their cars, Hawthorne and his co-driver won the race by 5 laps. There was no post-race celebration. Mike Hawthorne became Britain's first Formula One world champion in 1958, but immediately announced his retirement following the death of one of his close friends in one of his last races. On the 22nd of January 1959, at the age of just 29, he was killed when his speeding Mark 1 Jaguar skidded off the A3 at Guildford. Ruth Ellis' former husband George, also blighted with alcohol, hanged himself in his Jersey hotel room in August 1958. In 1969, Ellis's mother, Bertha Nielsen, was found unconscious in a gas-filled room in her flat in Hemel Hempstead. She never fully recovered and died a decade later. Ellis's son Andy, who was 10 at the time of his mother's execution, also took his own life in a bedsit in 1982. It was recorded that trial judge Sir Cecil Havers, who had wrote to the Home Office asking for Ruth Ellis to be reprieved, had sent money every year for her son's upkeep, and prosecution counsel Christmas Humphreys paid her son's funeral costs. Her daughter Georgina, who was aged 3 when her mother was executed, was fostered after the death of her father and died of cancer in 2001 at the age of 50. Desmond Cousin emigrated to Australia, where he died in 1991 after years of fighting alcohol addiction. The story of this case has appeared in TV and film on a number of occasions. Within a year of the execution, Diana Dowes starred in Yield to the Night, a melodrama that, whilst not telling the story of the murder of David Blakely, is clearly inspired by the case. In 1985, Blackadder star Miranda Richardson played Ruth Ellis and Rupert Everett David Blakely in Dance with a Stranger, and more recently, the case was a subject to a TV series, A Cruel Love. What made the latter stand out was the fact that the trial judge, Sir Cecil Havers, was played on TV by his grandson, actor Nigel Havers. In 2003, the case was referred back to the Court of Appeal by the Criminal Case Review Commission. Firmly rejecting the appeal, the court made it clear they could rule only on the conviction based on the law as it stood in 1955, and not whether Ruth Ellis should have been executed. And finally, following the popularity of the Jack the Ripper guided walks, one night in the 1990s, a landlady of the Magdala Tavern decided to cash in on the crime-enthusiastic sightseeing trade by taking a drill and manufacturing 2 bullet holes, which locals would then point out to unwary tourists were made that Easter Sunday when Ruth Ellis shot dead David Blakely and became the last woman to be hanged in the UK. Two similar tales, driven by jealousy, but with 2 very different outcomes. Had Florence Ransom committed her crime when the country was at peace and newspapers not filled with stories of the war, her brutal crimes would surely be far more well known and her name as infamous as that of Ruth Ellis. Was it fair that a triple killer should avoid the gallows and, despite being insane, should ultimately be released back into society, while a woman recovering from the traumas of a miscarriage who shoots dead her violent partner should pay the ultimate penalty? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. You'll be watching another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. Until the next time, thank you and goodbye.